Hi there. In this video, I'm going to be going over the correct answers to the first passage from the 2008 released AP English Language and Composition multiple choice exam that talks about word origins. For most questions, I'll also be explaining why the correct answer is correct and all the other answers are incorrect. So let's go ahead and get started. First question. In the passage as a whole, a major shift in the development of the argument occurs at which of the following points? All right, well, the answer to this one is C, so what's really going on in line 40? The first half of the passage through line 39 primarily argues that people have been upset about changes happening in English contemporary to their own lives for a long time. But starting with line 40, the author pivots to explaining why people typically react this way, providing mostly social examples. Number two, for this one and for many questions that ask you about an idea that unifies several examples, one needs to look at the lines that come before it. So let's look at lines 3 to 6 for this one. They read, they may consider that change is fine as long as it's part of history. Anything occurring now is calamitous. We've always been this way. Answer choices A, B, and C refer to faulty studies of word origins, tedious debates about grammar, and local misunderstandings of historical events, respectively. And none of these things are mentioned by the quoted gentleman in this section. So that leaves D and E as possible answer choices. However, D, snobbish rejections of modern vocabulary, uses a keyword, modern, that makes it incorrect. Nobody quoted in this section mentions modern vocabulary. That is vocabulary in the late 20th or early 20th century, modern to the readers of this passage. So that leaves one possible answer choice, E, and these authors, in fact, are hostile to unnecessary changes in word usage in their eras, and it's unnecessary to them, of course, not necessarily unnecessary from the perspective of the author of the passage. So, all right, a person attentive to language in the world should immediately notice here for number 3, right? The question's asking about hygienists. So a person attentive to language in the world should immediately associate the word hygienist with someone who cares about cleanliness and by extension purity. Personally, when I think of a hygienist, I'm thinking of those people that work in a dentist's office and clean your teeth, right? So likening keeping a language clean and pure because natural changes are dirty, like tooth gunk, is at least a little humorous. So A, lending a tone of mocking humor, right here, is the right answer. B, expanding the argument to a subject other than language is wrong because the subject of the passage, noting subject here, that's a rhetorical situation term, very important, that hasn't changed. The author is not deferring to any perspective, right? The author is actually pretty actively rejecting those of past language critics. So C, establish a deferential attitude about the subject, is wrong. The author has a pretty strong stance. He's far from objective. So he's not providing an objective approach to the argument. We can go ahead and take D and throw that right off a balcony because that's wrong. So E is wrong because the author is using Roman hygienists as a centuries-old example of the same major point, that language changes are something people don't like, and that doesn't make any sense, right? People don't like language change like it's normal, and it's just part of languages. That's what they do. They change. All right. Number 4. What the author refers to as weeds in line 34. We're looking here. By then, there will be new weeds to eradicate. So this question's a lot like, no, let's see here. This question continues asking about the idea the author rejects that changes in language are bad things, like tartar on teeth or weeds in a garden, and so things that should be gotten rid of. So naturally, the correct answer is A, usage changes, right? That's really the topic of this section, the subject of this section. No obsolete terms, answer choice B, are mentioned in this part of the passage. In fact, the author is discussing newly introduced terms at various times, which is sort of the opposite thing. Diction or word choice, or as my students would know, mot juste errors, those are also not mentioned here. A cliche or overused hackneyed phrase is also very different than new terms, which is what the author is talking about. While likening a weed to a non-standard usage is metaphorical, the author is not referring to metaphors as weeds, but is rather taking on the perspective of the critics whose idea is rejecting in saying that usages would need to be removed. So E too is wrong. Yeah, and again, that makes it so A is, of course, the correct answer. Alrighty, so number 5, the word chopsticked. Line 38 is used an example of one of these things. Chopsticked is over here. The waiter was praising a customer for having chopsticked. So, well, will this verb catch on? Time will tell. Okay, so this question's a lot like number 2, in that the key to answering it correctly comes from the lines that come immediately before it. You'll often find that authors provide examples. So again, we're in the rhetorical mode of exemplification here. After having made some kind of claim, right? They make a claim, they have examples. So we need to look for the claim. Line 35 reads, there will be no, one such was reported to me by someone who overheard it in a Chinese restaurant. And the antecedent of such here, we've got to look at such. Such is behaving like a pronoun. So the antecedent of such is weeds, which is referring back to newcomers. Newcomers is sort of personifying the words themselves, new words, right? And that is referring back to verbs that were made from nouns, like to invoice, right? There's all of these like connections or hyperlinks between nouns in this passage. So B, therefore, is the correct answer, a verb form created from a noun. Chopstick definitely did not come from the Chinese word for the items. The Chinese word is quite so that's definitely not, that sounds nothing like chopstick. We clearly did not get that word from the Chinese, and pardon my pronunciation if I said something other than what I intended to. So all the other remaining answers here, they ignore that the author is engaging in exemplification, or they refer to other parts of the passage, and they're not referring back to the part that the question is actually asking about, line 38, and its environs. Okay, number 6. We're going to go up here and then over here to number 6. Okay, so paragraph 3. Lines 40 to 53 implies that those who would strictly follow the rules of the English language feel one of these ways. So to answer this one correctly, your attention should immediately go back to the section of the passage to which the question refers, lines 40 to 53. Looking over here at line 40, the author writes, maybe they, those who would strictly follow the rules of English, don't want to be identified with the kind of people who would use such language. We're like over here. So if a person would reject another person for using such language, then the one answer choice that really works here is answer choice E. Those people would be anxious about how their own use of language affects other people's perceptions of them, right? We're talking about social interaction. This question is very sociological, so E is definitely the correct answer. Number 7. So for 7, this question's about overall passage development. So paragraph 3 focuses primarily on the way language change impacts individual relationships. And then paragraph 4 transitions by mentioning Jonathan Swift's connection between language change and the loose morals of the society in which he lived. And then as that paragraph progresses, the author brings in the American relationship to Britain after the American Revolution, and then the author brings in the 20th century sociolinguistic and sociopolitical relationship between America and Australia, talking about like America as a cultural, political, and economic superpower. So Given all of these facts, answer choice B here is the one that checks out, broadening from people's immediate circle of context to their own larger society and then to an international perspective. A is wrong because the author doesn't really talk about intentional language changes. The C is just layers and layers of wrong. That doesn't work at all, right? Spelling is not a major feature of the argument until the end of the section to which the question is referring, 40 to 74. And D, D is wrong because there's no mention of the relationship between social concord and or peaceful agreement and the language that's actually in the passage. And then E, let's see, drawing a parallel between examples from the world of business and the world of international relations. I don't know what they're referring to with business here. That sounds pretty, that seems really irrelevant. So he's not right either. Okay, number 8. So for this question, you can mostly ignore the part about Jonathan Swift at the beginning of this section, lines 54 to 74. You should focus on what the passage says about Noah Webster and about Australians' responses to American spellings. In both cases, nationalism, or fervent love of one's country and the linguistic traditions therein in this context, are a prominent feature. So B, nationalism influences reactions to linguistic changes right here, therefore is the right answer. A is wrong because the author implicitly argues the opposite. Language changes are often the result of political discord. C could be a red herring answer because it's unlikely there's any relationship between pause and loose morals, but the author's not trying to argue the extent to which such generalizations are valid, so that does not really make sense. D is contradicted by nearly every example in the passage because linguistic changes have always been happening despite attempts to rein them in. And then E, dominant nations undergo more linguistic change than powerful nations, implies the opposite of what lines 54 to 74 imply, that the more powerful nations often force linguistic change on less powerful ones. That's so not true at all. Right, so clearly our answer B, nationalism influences the reactions to linguistic changes, is the correct one. Okay, moving on, number 9. So I'm having a little bit of background knowledge for number 9 concerning the allusions to Alfred the Great and Chaucer. They aren't necessary to get the question correct, to answer it correctly, but they do really help here. So the final example down here, considering the idea that Alfred the Great, who's a speaker of Old English born around 849, would be completely shocked to see the changes his language experienced in Chaucer's Middle English spoken in the mid-1300s. That adds a bit of exaggeration to the idea that people often reject language changes as they happen in their own times, and that's really what makes A build on the point made in lines 1 to 5, right, that people see changes happening right now as calamitous, but they're okay if, they're just part of history. That's really the idea that's being built on. So the authors definitely moved away from using Australia as and the relationship between America and Australia as an example by this point in the passage, lines 75 to 80. So C doesn't really make sense. B doesn't make sense. Chaucer is not a contemporary leader, just a writer in the Middle Ages, so C doesn't make sense. D uses the word document as a verb, right? The word document, if you unpack the language, that implies the provision of evidence to support a claim, usually from some kind of document. So that doesn't really make sense here. That's not what the author's doing. There's no citation of changes taking place in Alfred the Great's Old English in lines 75 to 80. Webster was talking about British English spellings contrasting with American ones being normalized in the same era, which is very different than the centuries of language evolution between Alfred the Great and Chaucer, so E, too, is incorrect. All right. 10. Well, lines 70 to 72 in the passage here really explicitly answer the question for number 10. The lines here read, "It's a linguistic insecurity born of the inescapable dominance of America as a cultural, political, and economic superpower." Right. So D, obviously, almost, is the correct answer. The author doesn't discuss simpler times in this portion of the passage, nor is there mention of American tourists, so A and B are wrong. Given the author's citing of American hegemony and numerous past examples, it's likely the author believes the opposite of choice E, that local usage will ultimately prevail. That's sort of ridiculous. C is an answer that might attract some readers, but an understanding of the passage as a whole makes the term inaccuracies in American usage too biased for the tone and approach of this particular author. The author likely does not see different spellings as inaccurate, but simply the result of different social and political circumstances as well. Okay, 11. The attitude of the author toward the English language in this passage is one of these things. So this is actually sort of similar to the Brudenell's passage from Monday or Tuesday, if you're in even one of my classes. It's essential that you read the last lines of the passage as closely as all the others, right? If you skip over the ending, you're not going to get this question correct. So if you didn't read those passages closely, you would have really struggled with this question. The phrase, "the future of English has never looked so good," makes answer choice D, interest in the past of and optimism for the future of English, the most obvious choice for the author's attitude toward the English language. Number 12 is over here. The tone in the passage overall is best described as one of these things. The author seems fairly reasonable in his assertions, so dramatic seems inappropriate. Confidential implies that what one is saying should be kept secret, which is generally the opposite of the purpose of academic pieces like this one. People want to publish academic pieces, and if you know that about this genre of writing, you would definitely see B is not going to work. Impressionism is an art form focused on one's feelings, right, and how something feels. So the Impressionism tends to be a little less reliant on reality or evidence, but the way reality impacts one's feelings and perceptions. That is not consistent with this author's rhetorical choices, so C is wrong. The author seems to reject people who take moralistic and rigid approaches to language, and he instead implies that language change is normal and even interesting. So E can go right out the window. The only answer choice left is D, and our conversation a few minutes ago about terms like weeds and hygienists discussed earlier also helped to support the choice of the adjective playful. And thoughtful, of course, just indicates that he is engaged in thought in the process of producing his work. So D, clearly the best answer. 13. This question might be the hardest one of all the 14. So you have to know what all of these terms refer to, and you have to be able to find them quickly in the passage, or have been able to identify them previously in order to answer the question correctly. So we're going to just go through these one at a time. So loosely defining rhetorical question as a question that's not meant to be answered by an interlocutor, but simply asked by an author to help achieve some rhetorical purpose. The author uses at least two rhetorical questions. One is over here in line 38. What is it? Will this verb catch on? Time will tell. Okay, that's one of them. And then the other one is almost right after it. It starts down here. So what's really going on when people object to words and word usage in this way? So this may not necessarily be how you typically come across rhetorical questions, but I think they loosely meet a definition of rhetorical questions. So one checks out. Because one checks out, A and C are instantly eliminated. There are references to grammatical terms everywhere in this passage. So some examples might include, let's see, noun, verb, adjective usages, prefix, suffix, and inflection, which is the same thing as conjugation. Because to appears, that kicks D out of the running here. Famous writers are quoted twice between lines 5 and line 15. That eliminates B. So the only answer choice left is E, all four of them. All four of the listed rhetorical choices, that is. Just for fun, you can also find examples from diverse eras throughout. Wallace, over here, wrote in 1653, Johnson in 1755. Romans wrote in Latin for about 1,000 years between 753 BC and 476 AD. Noah Webster was writing a dictionary with which you might be familiar around 1806. And the examples of chopsticks down here and Australian and American spellings over here are all fairly modern. All of these clearly reinforce that E is the correct answer here. 14. Let's go ahead and work backwards through the answers here. So the author isn't an aloof judge. It's clear he has a perspective on language change in English. He thinks it's okay, right? And he thinks it's natural, and he sort of is playfully poking fun at those who historically have railed against it. I'm not really sure what the author is amused about, and the tone is not really one, I hope, that one would use in the workplace with a colleague. The result might be branding by one's colleagues as an insufferably didactic nerd. Just kidding. Therefore, D can go. I don't see much evidence of the writer being either sympathetic or angry, just mostly factual in a lightly humoristic way. So B and C are not great answers, and A is left in an informed commentator. The author has things to say about the English language and how it's changed, and he provides evidence to back up his claims. So A checks out as the correct answer. Alrighty, we went through all those really fast. I hope this video was helpful. Comments are enabled, so you can ask questions for further clarification if needed. Alrighty, end of file.